And I remember in one of her letters, she spoke about her brother, because her brother is doing a life sentence because he killed someone. It affects whether we will be successful. It affects how much money we will make. It affects our health, whether we're going to get diabetes or eczema or heart problems or even cancer. Everything happens in childhood. Lots of adults are actually children that are trapped in adults' bodies. People that have this protective, bulletproof outer, front, that, I'm resilient, I can handle it, I've been through so much. They are hiding so much pain that they're just focusing it on the outside. And I saw that in prison. Hi everyone, and welcome to the second part of my series on how to help your child avoid a life of crime. I want to start by sharing a story. In the UK, I spent about 8 years in different high security UK prisons, and I got to know this prisoner who was in prison serving a life sentence because he went to rob someone and there was a struggle and he ended up stabbing the person and killing him. Why did he go to rob him? Is because he was a drug addict and he needed money to pay for the drugs, and he went to rob someone and the guy struggled or resisted and he stabbed him and killed him. Now, I met this person in prison and I had many interactions with him. Sometimes I would talk, and I saw him to be a very respectful young man, because now he's away from drugs, he's away from his bad influences or whatever, and I just saw in front of me a polite, respectful, humble young man. Now, in prison, he was involved in a lot of violent incidents. I think he stabbed several, lots of people in prison. He was always going to the segregation unit, always getting in trouble. And he wasn't particularly a big guy, but in his eyes, I could see both kindness and I could see some sadness in his eyes. Because my case was very high profile, I received tens of thousands of letters from members of the public from all over the world, letters, cards, letters of support, sympathy, people sharing their lives with me and people trying to give me support. So the sister of this young man, she used to write to me in prison. And I remember in one of her letters, she spoke about her brother. And she spoke about how losing her brother was like one of the worst things that happened to her, because her brother is doing a life sentence because he killed someone. And in one letter I remember she wrote, she said, "My dad used to beat my brothers so hard." She said, "I still remember that. He used to beat them so much, he used to beat them." And for me, that made sense. That this innocent child who was born as a baby and had come into the world with a sparkle in its eyes, full of love and wonder and amazement, and looking at the adults around it to help it, to support it, to show it the world. And this father would beat it, not once, not twice, but repeatedly, really, really hard. Was it surprising that when this child grew up, it would have no problem doing violence to someone else? It would have no problem doing that? There are some videos and resources which I've put in the description. When you finish this video, please read the description and please click on some of those links. There is a clip in particular called "Step Inside the Circle." It's about 8-minute long clip. Please, I request you, when you finish this, click on that and watch that clip. And it will tell you about how childhood trauma, or how things that happen in childhood, how it affects adulthood. What happens to us in early childhood, trauma that happens to us, and I'll talk about what is trauma, but what happens to us in childhood, it affects our entire lives. It affects what we will become in life. It affects whether we will be successful. It affects how much money we will make. It affects our health, whether we're going to get diabetes or eczema or heart problems or even cancer. Everything happens in childhood. There is this thing called ACEs, Adverse Childhood Experiences. And there is a ACEs questionnaire, which is like 10 questions that psychologists or therapists, they ask you. And you will see that these talk about what happened in the childhood of this person. The more of these 10 things that happen to a person in their childhood, the more likely they are to have carried with them the effects of trauma later on in their lives. So it all starts in childhood. Now, so everything starts in childhood. When I talk about childhood trauma, you have the big abuse, which is something like physical abuse, sexual abuse, verbal abuse, all of this that is happening to a child. And then you have the other type of abuse, which is also a type of trauma, but people may not think that it is. So for example, neglect or emotional neglect, where the caregivers do not connect with that child or listen to that child or allow that child to express its feelings. Childhood trauma and childhood abuse, it does not mean that everyone who had trauma and abuse in their childhood is going to go on to live a life of crime. Most people are not. Most people, even if they had something like that, are not going to go and enter into a life of crime. But on the other hand, there is a direct link between people that had these adverse childhood experiences and that suffered abuse and neglect as children, who then later on went and found comfort and safety and security in a gang, or they did to others violence that was far worse than what happened to them. There is one of the leading authorities on this subject is a man by the name of Dr. Gabor Mate. I've put his name in the description below, and I've put some YouTube links. He has an active YouTube channel and he's written several books as well, and you will find there's one or two links that I've put below about him, and you'll be able to find, and you can go and listen to more about this subject. People, they say that, oh, my father beat me, I turned out okay. Look at me, I've got a successful business, or I've got a successful job, and I've drive a nice car and blah blah blah. And I mean, is that success? How do you treat your own children? Do you feel safe sharing vulnerabilities, talking about things that you find difficult or challenging? Are you closed up? Do you find it easy to talk about your emotions? Are you scared what people think of you? So turning out okay, money is not the only factor which you can decide whether a person turned out okay. You might think you turned out okay. Does your wife think that? Your kids think that? Your brothers and sisters think you turned out okay? People that know you, your close friends, do they think you turned out okay? How comes you have panic attacks? How comes you suffer from anxiety? Why are you like 32 years old and you've got diabetes? Or you have high blood pressure? All of these things are linked. And one of the hardest things for people is to admit or acknowledge that there is this thing that exists. And as we grow up, there is an inner child in all of us. Lots of adults are actually children that are trapped in adults' bodies. Because the way we react when we are under stress, or when something happens that is not in our control, the way that we react, it's actually that child, that young child, expressing that need in a way that they were unable to do as children. You may say, oh, it's all in the mind over matter, you got to be strong, you got to be resilient. These are sorts of nonsense things that people, they say to try and live in denial or block out that this thing exists. Let me give you an example. You think it's all in the mind? You think trauma is something that's all in the mind? Anyone that is watching this video, I guarantee I can change the physiology of your body. I can change it in a second. How can I do that? As I'm speaking to you quietly and calmly, if all of a sudden, and I'm not going to do it, if all of a sudden I started to shout or scream, or I started to, like, as if I'm having a heart attack, or something began to happen, you know what's going to happen to you? Your heart rate is going to go up, your eyes are going to dilate, your muscles are going to tense up, your body is going to go into freeze or fight or flight, whatever they call it, your body is going to go into survival mode. You're going to think, what's happening here? So just by my words, and I'm behind the screen, I've changed your physiology. If you're watching a movie and there's some suspense, some thriller or some suspense happening, you see your heart rate go up. That's just a movie for a few minutes. Now imagine a child that sees a parent shouting at it, or beating it, or hitting it, or throwing things in front of it, or a child that's experiencing other people in the house. How do you think that child, what effect is it going to have on that child? Childhood trauma, it affects the brain development of children. There's a certain part of the brain of children that does not develop when the children are subjected to this. A caveat again, I don't mean if you're a parent and you've ever shouted at your child or you smacked your child and you're thinking, that's it, my life is ruined and my child's going to end up in prison. That's not what I'm talking about. There is no such thing as a perfect parent. No one had a perfect childhood. Most parents, they love their children. Even parents that are bad to their children, they love them and they do those things because they think it's in the benefit of the child. Parents that harm their children, that abuse their children, they often do that because the same happened to them when they were children. And then the same happened to them when they were... It's like a generational thing. That story that I told you at the start, where this sister is telling me what happened to her brothers and how her father used to beat her brothers really hard. I guarantee that the same happened to him when he was a child. So the body, it remembers. You may not remember. You may not think that, nothing affects me and I'm successful and I'm tough and I'm strong and I'm resilient. A lot of the time, the people that have these strong, and men especially have this issue, women sometimes as well, people that have this protective, bulletproof outer, front, that, I'm resilient, I can handle it, I've been through so much. They are hiding so much pain that they're just focusing it on the outside. And I saw that in prison. The guys with the guys with the biggest muscles, and as you can see, I got no muscles. There were guys who one of their biceps were equal to the size of my thighs. Big muscular guys. And often the guys with the biggest bodies, or who had the toughest fronts, they were people that were the most hurt and damaged and broken inside. So I'm not here to criticize. I'm here to talk about that there is a thing called childhood trauma. How we are treated as children and how we treat children in the early part of their lives determines how the rest of their life will be, whether they'll make friends or not, what their relationships will be like, whether they'll find it easy to have friendships, whether they'll find it easy to study or be successful in what they do, what they'll feel about themselves. All of these things, it happens from childhood. You may not remember, but the body, it keeps a score. So at the bottom, please read the description, and I've put some resources in here where you can find out about these things. Find out about childhood trauma. What is childhood trauma? What is childhood neglect? How does childhood trauma affect a person as they grow into adulthood? How can you resolve childhood trauma? There is always hope. Everything can be healed. Everything can be repaired. Inner child. What is inner child? What does it mean to reparent your inner child? Where you go back to that 3-year-old you or that 5-year-old you. Meditations. There are some meditations, and by meditation I don't mean a religious thing. It's just someone talking in a calm voice, telling you to breathe, close your eyes, breathe deeply, and then to think about aspects of your childhood, and then to feel safe or to speak to that child, things like that. I've done it and I've benefited from many of those. So one of the first things that you can do to help your child avoid a life of crime is to be aware what childhood trauma and what adverse childhood experiences are, and how a child's childhood affects what happens to them later on in life. So please look at the description, and there's a number of resources that I've put there that you can read up more about this topic. Until the next one, goodbye. أخي أنت
أنت حر بتلك القيود، إذا كنت بالله مستعصما، فماذا يضيرك كيد العبيد، فماذا يضيرك كيد العبيد. أخي أنت حر